Thank you very much for your time today. And Dennis, please, could you start your presentation and our webinar today? Thanks a lot.
Okay, can you hear me okay out there?
Yeah, Dennis, we could hear you. Very good. You just continue. Thanks.
Oh, okay. So it's an honor to be here again to share what we learned from so many families for so many years. This is my colleague, Dr. Chacoin, and my friend James in the middle. And over many years, we worked in a clinic in Chicago. And also, I worked in Denver with Barry, a physician. I am a social worker, a doctor of social work. My colleagues were physicians, and we saw over 6,000 people over many, many years. And we learned so much from these families. And from what I want to share today is so much of what we learned we called behavioral characteristics. They're incredibly consistent whether the child or adult. They're involve both strength and weaknesses or challenges, but they also give you an alternative to mental health labeling because they avoid descriptions like depression or obsessive compulsive disorder and give you ideas that help you understand and promote your son and daughter. It gives you then a way to solve a problem and not just a label, and all our families just want that. This is my colleague, Sheila Hebine, who's actually from England and was the head of a local parent group. This is her son, Chris. These are the issues that I will talk about today. There's 6 behavioral characteristics. These are really the essence of what we learned. And it is my job to try to package this and give it back to you in a way that's understandable and that makes sense to you. What it involves is relying on concrete versus abstract forms of thought. Expressive and receptive language is number 2. Number 3, social emotional skills, which are folks with Down syndrome have enormous sensitivity to people in the world. And also self-talk, and I hope this translates, it's just talking out loud to yourself. And groups is a very, it might be a little difficult to translate, but it's basically relying on set patterns and routines in your life. Some people call it obsessive compulsive tendencies, but they're very beneficial to most people. And also, probably one of the most important issues we learned is that people with Down syndrome are highly responsive to visual cues. Anything they see, they hold on to, they remember, they respond to. But they also, this is really interesting, they're highly responsive to, they remember everything they see. So they have like a photographic visual memory. So what I have not talked about in the past was concrete thinking and behaving. I'll just give you a brief example. There was a young man in my at the clinic in Chicago, and I asked him if he had a job, and he was working, and he said no. And I said, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. On the sheet here, it says that you have a great job in a grocery store you've had for a long time. And he looked at me with this look of amazement. And he said, silly, I'm not working right now. And so that's that sense of concrete versus this idea of kind of abstract kind of, it's most of our families are well aware that our guys can be kind of concrete in how they define things. Also, though, there are some issues related to how people learn and then translate learning to other settings. The behaviorists call it, they have some difficulty generalizing or transferring the information, the knowledge to another setting. And so what happens sometimes, people with Down syndrome are in groups where they learn about how to protect themselves and the community by saying no, by having a boundary, by telling people to go away or whatever. But what they found from these training groups is that it would often not result in people transferring the information they learned in the group to the community. So they had to change the whole training program to include primarily work in the communities. So they would train people in the work settings or in the grocery stores or shopping centers in the community, so that they would generalize and not just keep them confined in these training groups. And that has a lot to do then with how you learn in concrete thinking versus more abstract. And I'll explain that in a few minutes. And also there were some travel nightmares, and I'll discuss that. Abstract thought allows people to see different relationships between things and not just the individual or concrete case. It allows people to see other ways to deal with a problem or situation. And just to give you an example of that scares our families, there was a young man who would ride back and forth to work on a bus, and all of a sudden this bus came to a detour and just simply went a different way. And the young man with Down syndrome panicked because it wasn't the set way he was used to. And in the middle of Chicago, he got off the bus and just kind of wandered around. Now, this wouldn't necessarily happen now because people have phones, but still this idea that people have one way to do things can create some problems for them. Also, there's a kind of a comical situation. There's a gentleman in Madison, Wisconsin, in the US named Lou Brown. He talked about a training event where they had people who were trained to get on these huge cardboard buses. And not sure why they choose to do that, but the day came when the group who were learning to get on buses were sent out to actually get on buses, and none of them got on the buses. They didn't get on the buses because they were actually waiting for the cardboard buses. So you kind of got to be careful how you introduce things. And also, what then do you do with concrete thought? And we can use all kinds of adaptive strategies because folks with Down syndrome have so many interesting but adaptive things. And that's a good part of what I want to talk about today. Now, the people are concrete, but they're also very, very practical. So there are huge advantages to being concrete. There are folks with Down syndrome tend to be very down to earth, very grounded. I don't know if that translates. They live in the here and now, and there's huge benefits to that. In fact, pretty much every spiritual tradition, every form of meditation, prayer, or yoga depends very heavily on that living in the here and now. And also, this is kind of help me with this because we call this the pace. People with Down syndrome have a reputation for having two speeds, slow and slower, and slower and families know this, recognize it, they can laugh about it, but the truth is that we can learn so much from our folks with Down syndrome. They teach us. I really learned so much on how to slow down and take in the world around me, which they do, and not be this crazy, intense, pressured way of looking at things. And so we can really benefit from our sons and daughters, your sons and daughters, learn how to slow down, experience the joys and pleasures of the here and now. There's an author in the States that people may have heard about her. She's a very interesting woman named Martha Beck. She has a son with Down syndrome. She's described her son in very interesting ways. But she said people with Down syndrome literally and figuratively stop to smell the roses, and we can again learn from them. So probably the most significant advantage to concrete thinking is allows us to avoid the pursuit of success or living just for money. In the US, they call it keeping up with the Joneses, this mythical family who's doing everything right. And it results in a sacrifice of time with families and friends. This picture is my late wife. I feel sad just thinking about it. About 10 years ago, she died. She was I learned so much from her, but her thing was on her deathbed, she said, I really feel like I wish I had a little more time with people. She was very sensitive to people, but even for her. So the concrete part of this can be so beneficial to so many of us. Just focusing on truly what matters in life. So let me slip into some of the more components. Expressive language is one of those issues. And by the way, I will come back to concrete and abstract throughout the course of this presentation. But expressive and receptive language are highly significant issues for people with Down syndrome. For a long time, I thought their receptive language skills were phenomenal, and they are, but they also don't always know how to interpret what they're taking in. Over and over in our clinic, we see people always surprise me because it would seem like they weren't really necessarily taking in the information of what was going on. And in fact, they could tell you verbatim what happened in the room because it's almost like they tape record what happened. So they do take in everything. But again, they don't always know how to interpret it. The key issue for expressive language is that verbal language is clearly not a strength for our guys. They are not good on their feet. I don't know if that's an idiom, but meaning it's not a safe place for them. There are far better mediums than the spoken word. And so there is a concept in the US called taking the fifth. And let me explain that just briefly. The fifth is the Fifth Amendment of a Constitution. And that allows you to take the fifth when you're in a court of law or in front of Congress and they ask you, are you a mafia? Did you do this, this, and this? And you can say, I'm taking the fifth, meaning you don't have to incriminate yourself. And so when asked, when our folks with Down syndrome, this, by the way, is Daniel. He's a very interesting guy. When Daniel is asked, how was your day, Daniel? Like so many of our folks with Down syndrome, a question about something they did, which appears even vaguely critical and neutral. Many will simply answer, I don't know, shrug or walk away, but they try to avoid the answer because they're simply not comfortable. They don't feel on an even footing. And they want to please. So it's a really tricky place for them. And so the, the, as a result of this, it can create some problems because people can't always tell you what's happening to them. They can't communicate a problem or issue. And as a result, they can't really find ways of engaging help from people. And that can clearly create some problems. This is in so many ways why we needed to depend so heavily on family and people who live with people with Down syndrome to help us interpret what was going on. And why in our clinic we had a physician and a doctor of social work, because we were helping to kind of get to all the possible causes why people would have an issue or concern. So let me give you an example. There was a young man who was in a job in Chicago, and in this case, a good grocery store job. And he was asked by his boss to retrieve the carts from the parking lot. In the US, the people take the carts out to the car like in Europe. And he went to the door to go outside and he went no farther. And his boss said, James, go get the carts, please. That's part of your job. And he couldn't do it. And eventually, even though he was such a good employee, he couldn't go out to get the carts, and he was laid off from his job. And we learned only much later why this happened. Even though he continued to do so well in the store and people liked James so much, his boss liked him very much too, but because he couldn't do a significant part of his job, he lost the job. It turns out that after he was laid off, there was a woman who was a customer who came in to say, where's James? And his boss said, well, I'm sorry, he was laid off and he's no longer with us. And so she said, oh, that's terrible, because I saw that he was bumped in the parking lot by a car. And what happened to James at that time was he got very, very upset by this. It didn't hurt him, but it scared the heck out of him. It created this trauma. So, and we'll come back to this every time he was asked to go outside, he would get to the door and he would replay the scene of being bumped by the car. And he replayed it because it has this exceptional visual memory, which can be a real strength, but in this case, it's a problem. So he could not tell people what happened because he couldn't verbalize. And in fact, part of the reason he couldn't tell them was simply because if he told them, he would relive the very scene and situation that was so terrifying to him. So I will come back and explain this more, but this is one of those situations where we only learn too late what happened because James couldn't tell us. So ironically, we can use concrete thinking and behaving to actually help us, to help people communicate to us. It may actually help them if, even though there is some limited communications, because if we rely on concrete and visual, which I'll explain in a few seconds, we may actually help them get to what it is they need us to know. So remember, as you know, as parents, as professionals familiar with people with Down syndrome, that they tend to be concrete and visual. And we'll again explain visual. They're both huge strengths. Encourage them to use words that are concrete and visual, and something then they can see and touch in their immediate world to explain their world to you. And we also have to be exceptionally patient to hear them. The one thing I learned is families, if anything, you have to also pair visual and concrete with the spoken word. This may include pictures that show you. Imagine then a different scene from a typical evening where you ask your son or daughter to explain what you did, and they just can't. They're either a little too afraid to verbalize it or don't feel comfortable, or in fact, they take the fifth. But what if they had a camera, which all our guys now have on their phones, and when you ask them, what did you do? They simply pulled up their phone and showed you pictures of where they went, where they played music, that they worked, that they danced. And by the way, so many of our guys love Elvis that we have probably more Elvis impersonators in the world of Down syndrome than any other place. So they could show you a restaurant, the food they ate, just different things, and simply add a few words, and that's all they would need. Remember too, that the written word is still visual. Again, it's a huge strength. So if our folks take notes or they journal, they write out ideas, they can communicate often to you very rich, sophisticated ideas that they wouldn't normally be able to communicate. Let me give you an example. There was in Los Angeles, I was asked by a family to meet with them during a conference, and the mother came in. She was very interesting, very strong, capable person. And her son, though, worked in the movie industry, her son with Down syndrome. And the mother had described him as having a great deal of difficulty talking to her. And she was quite upset with this. And as I continued to ask her what this was all about, I asked him and shook his hand, and he was a very substantial young man working in the movie industry, very down to earth, very well liked by people. And I said, well, I don't understand, because it seems like you have so many good things going for you. And then I realized that something was happening between mother and son. So I asked him to talk to his mother. And I was quite surprised when he talked to her in this tiny little voice. He was intimidated by her. So what I asked her to do, or I asked him to do, was simply write down to the course of his day some of the ideas that he needed to communicate to her. And then at the end of the day, come to her. And with his notes in hand, which gave him a great deal of courage and strength, he was able to communicate to his mother. And this turns out to have worked extremely well. In the meantime, his mother laughed in our meeting, because she said, you know, I realized that he had used these Post-it note things and left them all over the house as a way to communicate. So he had already been doing what I suggested. He had just stopped doing it for a while. So I asked him to go back. So I want to talk about a young man who worked in a grocery store. This is my friend Patrick again. He was in a job that his mom and dad found through the job service, and he loved the job. But he came home one day, much to their shock, and they were upset because he came home and said, I want to quit. And he apparently loved this job because he could flirt with girls, but he was also extremely conscientious. His boss loved him. They all appreciated his skills. And he had been doing this job for several years. And then he came home and said, I hate the place. But they asked him, why do you want to quit? But he could not say it. And so we knew we had to find a way for him to let us know what happened, some concrete visual way to So I asked them to go, both his mother, and in the States they have job coaches, and back to the store, which took a lot of convincing because he was so, clearly he was afraid of the store. But we convinced him to go, and he went. He walked around the store, pointed to the back room, and he happened to point to his head, and there was a slight bruise on his head that his mother had just noticed. And it turns out, as we were able to piece together the story, he had been hurt using a trash compactor, and it scared the heck out of him. And he just was so traumatized by this experience, but he had no way to let people know. He couldn't talk about it because he would relive the experience. And so we only knew because he could point to it. So his job coach talked and talked to him. Eventually was able to set it up with encouragement from Patrick's boss. They had a schedule that he was allowed to go back to work and totally avoid the back room. Eventually, I learned that he was actually even able to use the trash compactor again, but he worked with another worker in the store to help him. So sometimes expressive language skills simply rely on our being able to see and interpret what people need us to. I needed to put this slide in too. This is a picture I actually took in my office. This too is a gentleman named Patrick with his mom. And what we find, most people with Down syndrome are extremely attuned to feelings and emotions. They have an exceptional intuition and uncanny sensitivity to others, especially loved ones. I don't know how many times I've heard from families the fact that their son or daughter with Down syndrome can actually tell them and interpret their emotions before they do. They know when they're sad or happy or unhappy, because our folks with Down syndrome are so good at interpreting and reading people's emotions. And this works to their benefit in so many ways, with their friends, with children, with their families, in their jobs, in their dating situations. So it really pays off. But the sensitivity may also be a huge issue because people may be a little too sensitive, especially to anger. And I don't know, there were so many times when we found people were very afraid to go back to a work setting or a place they live because there was something in the air, some tension or conflict. And what was interesting, it didn't even have to include them directly, but they just did not have a defensive mechanism to block the emotions, and they were overwhelmed. So it was very, very difficult for them. So we've always warned families, if there is a shutdown of any kind, be aware your sons and daughters of any age are highly attuned and sensitive to the emotions or feelings or conflict or tension in the environment. So they can't always block it, and they can be susceptible to it. Also, this notion of self-talk, I want to get to that really briefly because that can interact with concrete and visual, and I'll explain it in just a few minutes. But actually, it's more like 30 or 40 years. 40 years ago, we wrote about self-talk. And when we first started the clinic in Chicago, we had, and we saw initially hundreds and hundreds of people, but they came in, too many of them were on major antipsychotic medications simply because they were talking out loud to themselves. And this was just unacceptable. It just did not make any sense. So we kind of pulled together an article that actually has been copied and sent around the world. I don't know how many times, because it just was so, it just was kind of terrifying to us that this existed. But self-talk, talking out loud to yourself. And by the way, this cartoon is just kind of interesting.
I'm sorry, Dennis, could I just interrupt you a little bit? Could you be closer to microphone?
Absolutely.
Our speakers, our translators ask if it's possible. Thank you, Dennis.
Absolutely. Okay. So this cartoon I always liked because here's a gentleman walking down the street saying out loud to himself, I will not talk to myself. I will not talk to myself. And this seemed to be similar to our folks with Down syndrome. Hopefully this is loud enough for you guys. Please let me know if not. But now there's two major reasons why self-talk is a problem for teens and adults, especially, although even for children, self-talk is still not at all acceptable in public. And it can also be very alarming even in a private space because it involves fantasy play and imagined others. Imagine then your son and daughter in their own bedroom or even in the car, but primarily in their bedroom. And there's this huge play going on where they're talking to other people and it's full of sound and fury. And that kind of terrifies people if they don't know what it is. So we'll explain a little more how you can help people with that. Now, what we find out, we were quite surprised to find out that in fact, self-talk is revered among child development psychologists because self-talk is one of the most important tools for people to learn new tasks. And the way that happens is often a parent will talk the task that the child is learning out loud and help the child, but then the child will take that out loud self-talk in order to help himself do the task by himself. And so it's incredibly important at each stage of development. But by about the age of 7, most children, most typical children, will internalize the self-talk. So it's an inner voice. But it turns out that this internalizing this self-talk occurs at much later in typical children with challenges like learning problems, attention deficit, hearing or visual problems. And so what we know is they need that boost that the self-talk gives them. And it turns out then that all of us have self-talk. And we, as adults, have just learned how to keep it under our breath. But there's research study after research study that when you are faced with a challenging situation, you will often mutter under your breath. My wife has kind of chastised me for talking out loud. I've told her I have a license from the World Down Syndrome to talk out loud, so I'm allowed. So she just kind of, it's annoying to her sometimes. Okay. It appears then that we all talk out loud to ourselves. It's just that people with Down syndrome may not be as sensitive or aware of the need to cover it up. And so they need, then there's 3 reasons why self-talk is used by people with Down syndrome. They may actually need that extra boost more than anybody because of the challenges in their life, but they are not quite as sensitive or aware of the need to keep it under their breath or to cover it up. And I just want to tell you a brief little story. There was my friend Patrick here who was at home with his mother. She was a little upset with how he treated his brother. And so she said, Patrick, I don't like how you are with with James, your little brother. So Patrick responded to his mother, but it's too difficult for him face to face with that verbal thing that felt uncomfortable to him. He's not then on safe ground verbalizing his anger or his frustrations with his mother. So what happens, he went about 10 feet away, opened the door to a little bathroom down in their kitchen, went inside, closed the door, and his mother heard, "My mother, the horrible person that she is." It was very loud and his self-talk then was very out in the open, and his mother was very upset by that. She banged on the door and said, "Patrick, what are you doing? That's terrible." He came out and he was incensed because that was his private speech, his self-talk. And so sometimes it's pretty clear our guys don't know that self-talk is out loud. And also, I don't know how many times I've been called to schools or work settings where people are kind of freaked out or upset by one of our guys in a bathroom stall talking out loud because they think this is a private space and it clearly is not. So oops, what happened there? Oops, oh boy. Sorry guys, I just lost this. I'm looking. I'll find it. It's there someplace. I just don't. Oh, here it is. Okay, I got it. Sorry, guys. Technology's a pain sometimes. All right. So, like hugging or even masturbation, self-talk isn't nothing wrong, but it's just when and where it's expressed. So try to help people confine it to a private space and also learn how to maybe talk under their breath. Also, the people working with people in the autism spectrum field describe what they call teachable moments, which is simply this idea that because people learn in the moment, out in the community, you want to take advantage of those, in quotes, teachable moments on the spot, right as it occurs to help people. And that can include hugging people in a job situation where you say no, or self-talk. So self-talk is very helpful again, but it can be problematic. Also, finally, one more thing, families, when they initially came in, would describe their sons and daughters having these huge scenes in their bedrooms, and they were terrified by it and thought, do we need to go to a psychiatrist to get them on some major medications? Because it's facial expressions, hand gestures, body movements, as if they're enacting a play with at least one imaginary other. In fact, it's very, very healthy. It's if you kind of conceptualize, self-talk is just a way to express what they take in. So whatever is out in the community, they'll almost record it, bring it back to their room and act it out as a way to understand it. And that allows them to make sense out of our world, which is a little disturbing or upsetting or confusing to them. So they can bring this back. And we had a couple of funny stories about families who, one woman initially when she brought her son in said there was every night he would come back from school or work and go in his room and he would have these huge scenes that he acted out. And what happens, she finally screamed in at him and said, "Who are you talking to in there?" And the next thing you know, the door flew open and he yelled back at his mom, "To myself, who do you think?" So the truth is this, she kind of figured out that this self-talk was actually very helpful. And so this self-talk is a private lab where people can act out scenes and situations. And this is really important for families. They already understand this. This is kind of confirming what you already know. But if in that self-talk, there's a change in tone, if there's a self-criticism, if there are scenes that involve somebody calling your son or daughter or saying out loud, "I'm stupid," or "You're stupid," track this, because they may have a way to communicate what's going on through this that they could not say to you directly because of that verbal language, but you'll see it enacted in the room. And so often we had people kind of learn about situations that were disturbing or problematic in people's lives out in the community because they acted it up in the room. Also, people have a reputation for being stubborn. We call this grooves. A groove is records have these grooves, these ruts, these things. So we just named it the groove. But it's a set pattern and routine. Every person that has in their family a person with Down syndrome generally knows what these set patterns are. They can drive you a little crazy because they're so kind of consistent, but they do give order and structure to people's daily lives. There's a sense of neatness and order, even when it doesn't look like it. I don't know how many times people would have a room like this, and a parent or would go in the room and move something a few inches, and the person with Down syndrome would put it back immediately. Oops, I gotta plug in. Charger there. So it also, the groove gives a great deal of independence. Once task is a part of a daily routine, people are going to repeat it very reliably. So there's huge benefits. Also, for young and old, there's a huge amount of care and meticulousness with how they look and present themselves. And this is really, really important out there in the community because they are a sociological minority, meaning they have features that mark them as different in the world. And so they do draw attention. That can be a problem at times, and how then they present themselves can be. Grooves also allow free time activities that are kind of interesting because so many of our folks have an activity that they do over and over. And this scares some of the families because they think it's a form of autism. It really isn't. It's a form of meditation, actually, and it's as long as it does not interfere in their lives, their essential tasks, it's fine. And it's actually very, very calming and helpful. But what are these activities? It could be writing, it could be copying, it could be anything that's simple and short, drawing even, but repetitious activities that can be so beneficial. This is my friend Margaret. Margaret was quite a character. She loved, there was a TV show with Michael Landon, and she ultimately told me that I reminded her of Michael Landon, which was a huge compliment because she loved Michael. She was a sweetie. So it's a great way to relax, and it's like yoga, only cheaper. But grooves can be problematic in the sense that they are one of several ways that you can tell something is stressful to people with Down syndrome, your sons and daughters. In the same way that we have our favorite ways to communicate to us that we're under stress. For example, some of us get stomach aches or headaches, or some kind of part of our body holds tension. Well, a groove, that is some activity that repeats that's less productive, can be an indication that our folks are under some stress. And that's really important to understand. So let me give you an example of a group. There was a young man who worked in a good job, and he loved his activities, loved to dance, he had a girlfriend and would go out quite frequently with special rec activities. Had a greater social life than I'll ever have, but he stopped going. He didn't want to go to work. He just wanted to arrange his desk perfectly so that everything was just perfect. It's the kind of thing that can drive people a little crazy. But as we looked at it, his family brought him in and we began to take apart his situation. We found that his job had changed, his girlfriend was flirting with somebody else, and he had had some kind of a bully that was teasing him at a social rec activity. So we kind of approached each of these things separately. And what turns out, he had a thyroid problem that had not been diagnosed before. I don't know why it showed up at that point, but this change in his behavior was a clear indication that something was wrong. So we also recommend that you don't force people to change. His parents couldn't go in and just say, stop this doesn't work, but gently try to help him establish a new group. So as we treated his health issues and helped him sort out his problems at work, then we gradually helped him find a way to move out of arranging his desk. So that helped get him back on track. Also, then we're going to move into visual cues. There are other ways that we can use a visual, a picture, an image, because they're very, very powerful with people with Down syndrome, and they can help you reorganize and improve a set behavior that it can be effective. So one of the things we learned that was pretty amazing early on is that people with Down syndrome have like photographic memory. And the way this kind of began to show up was we would ask family, if you were to go into your son and daughter's room like this, their desk, and move something just an inch or two, what would happen? And they would laugh and say it would go back to the exact place immediately. And this was shocking to us because I don't remember what I have for lunch most of the time. I clearly don't remember where or I put stuff on my desk, but this was phenomenal. We'd also ask a simple thing: if you're driving around with your son and daughter and you go left rather than normal right, what would they do? And a lot of times they would say, oh my God, they would say, oh, stop, you're going the wrong way, because that visual memory is huge. And so our guys, our folks with Down syndrome, our girls, our people are from children all the way up to adulthood, tend to remember past people, places, and events in exceptional detail and in living color. And just a couple of the stories that were amazing to me is that people in the US who came from a European country would often go back to that country and remember people and events and places 10, 20 years later. And so this kind of memory is just unbelievably strong. So they also, we found our folks do not have trouble with, they don't get lost even in big shopping centers or big schools as long as they're there once. And they would often be able to tell their parents how to come back to the clinic because they have such good visual memory. Also, this was really wild to us. Visual images from TV and movies, really like some of the early Grease or some new movies, they would take in the movie whole and replace it and replay it. They know each line by heart, so that it was just astounding to me. It's like this capacity to kind of take it in whole. So the only problem with visual memory is that people tend to replay events as if they're happening now with the original feelings and emotions, which can be either really good or bad, depending on the event. But what that means is they're a little more susceptible to phobias, actually a lot more. So many of our folks are afraid of storms. They're afraid of if they have a run-in with an animal or bird or dog, they have trouble later in life, and also traumatic experiences. And some of the most difficult events involved some of our folks would have trouble choking and then could not eat solid food. I remember one young man, we worked with him and with some other specialists, and it took us over a year before he finally got past that whole traumatic memory. Also, kids in schools, when they move from elementary to schools where they have to move to different classes, first place, the noise in the halls were often overwhelming. And so the alarm that said it's time to change would often trigger their fear and they would just shut down. So we had to help the schools teach the schools to have them move either before or after. I won't talk more about this because this is something that truly helped us. Going back to the whole story of the young man who went to the parking lot to retrieve the car, got hit by a car. From that point on, could not go back to the parking lot. That's exactly what this is. It's a traumatic event that he simply couldn't get past. And so he lost his job. So it goes a long way to explain things. Our folks are visual learners. They love movies and pictures. And if you tell them something, they can forget. If you show them something, they never forget. And again, that can be really good or bad, but we say that the kind of grooves, that sense of routine and order that repeats is on board. It's part of our guys, but visual is king. It's really a huge issue for our folks. And so we learned also from the world of autism spectrum issues, because about 10-20% of our folks of any age had also autism issues and had worked with specialists in the autism world. And this was incredibly helpful because they use visual cues differently. They use pictures or visual sketches or checklists, which are hugely powerful. And calendars, visual images for learning. Calendars are incredibly important because, well, we found though that people are responsive to things depends on the person. They can be very highly responsive to these simple pictures, to computer-based things. You just have to experiment with what visual image works for our guys, but it can be so helpful to set up a daily schedule or what people want. It's a way to allow them to communicate, express their wants and needs, which is enormously important. And so, depends what kind of visual image depends on their preference, their age, but you have to experiment and play around with that. But let me give you an example of how you can just a simple way you can do this. There's a, say Susan, she's 16 to 20 years old. She could be any age. She could be 5 or 10, but she had two parents who were at a little bit at odds over parenting, but so they try to help her with things. And in fact, they get in the way because, like all people, she has a need to be independent, to take care of her own issues and concerns. And so the more they try to help her, the more she's, the only option she had was to act as she couldn't do anything. And so she just kind of regained her own sense of control by acting like she didn't have the skills. So we simply got her a schedule, a checklist, which again, people with Down syndrome, they love. Checklists are highly, they're responsive. So this was an actual schedule we set up with Susan. She'd get up and check off, take a shower, get dressed, brush her teeth, get out of bed. And the parents were shocked because they had no idea she could do any of this. And yet here she was, and it was because she was giving back control of this. The schedule, the visual was a strength for her, and she truly wanted to be in charge of her life. So the list tells her what to do and not her mom and dad, which is hugely important. So this also, I have to show you, this is my friend, Jeremy. Jeremy is really a sweet, sweet guy. And this is really interesting. He is sitting on a beach in Hawaii, in one of the islands. His mother took him there to meet with his mother's and this young man's aunt. And he has both Down syndrome and autism spectrum issues. And yet here he is sitting on the beach with his coconut. And the way she got him there was simply to track the whole trip visually. He had it. Flip through the picture here where we're going next. We land, we get the bags, we go to her sister's, we go to the beach. And a huge amount of work, but obviously it paid off. And on the left, you see going to the dentist. Again, these are these idea of social stories. This could be something that people are responsive to small figures, or even the picture of the actual dentist or nurse, but visual is everything. And I've heard so many people describe, it depends on the child. They use iPads, and so you can put the pictures and just scroll through it. There's a young man who went to Disneyland in New Year's Eve, which is phenomenally busy, but he was able to go despite autism spectrum issues and Down syndrome. He had a ball, just had a ball. So you can take advantage of grooves and visual skills to build strengths. Instead of bad habits, help them with good habits. Once these habits are set, they will continue. So you can get checklists. You can get checklists for food, for what they eat for breakfast. And people love that. It gives them, again, a sense of control and their own initiative. Also, this there's a concept here, the couch potato. I don't know if you've heard this in Europe, but it's just the idea you sit on a couch and you lounge like a big old potato. And so how do you get your son and daughter off the couch? You literally put the activities on a calendar and they will remind you. So, okay. So I want to come back to some, I don't know how much time we have, but this is coming back again to this notion of rigid or concrete.
Now it's 5 o'clock. You will take 1 hour and a half.
Less. Hello, Dennis.
Yeah.
You have so many slides more. It's very interesting. And you
Not too
ask
many
how much
more.
time you have, how much you, okay, please go on if it's not so many. Because I have heard
Yeah.
that you ask. Okay, thank you.
Okay, sure. So, I come back to this notion of when people have these routines that get them in trouble or they get stuck. And so the analogy I had is with jet pilots. Jet pilots learn when they're learning how to fly these jets. They're huge pieces of metal that if the engine stops, they drop like a stone, literally. Just they come out of the sky and they could die. And so they train these folks to kind of repeat the same issue when they do have trouble, because otherwise they'll panic and do the wrong thing and end up killing themselves. So they practice over and over and over, just kind of flipping the thing off and then rejecting. Otherwise, they can die. So with our folks, it's a similar thing in the sense that they can take advantage of role play. Role play is an amazing thing for our folks with Down syndrome. I don't know if this is translated. It's just this idea you kind of practice an activity by acting it out. You could do it with your family, with your friends, with your boss, anybody. And it builds a repertoire in your head. And then you can back it up on your phone or with a paper, or your iPad or cell phone, but it has a huge amount of power. So like social skill issues, our folks tend to get fired for social skill things and not because they don't know their jobs. So they're in a setting where they're not using social skills right. So for example, their boss says to them, come and see me anytime. And they do, because they don't understand that means it's just I'm your boss and I'm a friendly guy, but I really don't want you to come see me. The opposite, the other problem is people call me anytime. So we've had people who are calling their bosses or friends at 2 or 3 in the morning. So it's this concrete, it's like not quite understanding the nuance of, I didn't really mean anytime. And also kind of overly friendly in a work setting where you're very hugging, but you hug your boss or your customers and it just doesn't work. And so people lose jobs because of that. So the multi-step process for kind of helping people with that is to role play an appropriate way to deal with a customer or your boss. But you can't just do it in a group setting. It has to move to the actual place, their job or the school. And so they need to be taught skills in the moment, in the place, back to this notion of teachable moments. And so you can actually use strategic use of self-talk or things to help people, but this role play has much more power than people understand. I don't know why, but if you act things out, people will remember it because that visual memory is phenomenal. Also, just a few more things around concrete issues. If you put stuff on calendars, because time is tricky for our folks. It can be too abstract. But people get real time. They don't miss their favorite shows. They're never late for dinner. And so even in a work setting, if the boss says take a 15-minute break, they don't know what that means. But if you say on your watch, when the big hands on one go, when the big hands on three come back, they totally get that and they're better than anybody else. So you use real concrete time, whether analog or digital. And also calendars are hugely important. Just did that. Calendars, we were shocked by how many people could use 3 or 4 calendars at a time, but the more you think about it, they see the days, the times, the events, and it just makes sense. They can predict and plan and everything else. And so we highly suggested to families that they use a calendar. Now, if you happen to have to change a date, don't just expect your son and daughter to hear about it. Go back to the calendar. Let them see it on the calendar, and that'll work. Also, just past tense, future and past tense can be tricky for our guys. So I've had people describe, there was a work meeting where this young man, you out of time?
Then it's just if you could be closer to microphone, if you few slides
okay.
you have more, yeah?
Yeah.
I know you are tired, I'm sorry after long time.
No.
Yeah,
I mean, it's frustrating and you guys are working so hard to translate this. In a meeting, this young man, the meeting was at school, and it was just to review progress over the course of this year. And the teachers were there, and his mom happened to be there. And this young man stood up and said, "I was beaten." And the staff, the teachers were very upset because they couldn't understand where this came from. It made them look bad, made it look like they were hurting this kid or something. It turns out that in fact, a year before at the same meeting, he said the same thing because he had been bullied by a young kid in a class. And so this was helpful. The mom was aware of this last event, and instead of saying I was beaten, it was literally something from the past. Running out of time on this one. Humor is a little tricky. People with Down syndrome have a great sense of humor. They can play and tease, but sometimes they just don't always get the joke. And so you got to be a little careful because they may feel they're made fun of. This is one of the interesting things. So many of our folks love wrestling and the Three Stooges and different things that are pretty violent, if you ask me, but it's so interesting that nobody who loved these kind of shows ever displayed physical aggression to another person as if to repeat what they showed. So what that means is they truly get that this is theater, it's drama, it's humor. Okay, I think that's like been a marathon. I think I probably should call it quits for today. I hope the pacing was okay for you guys. But I just, it's such a treat to be able to come back and talk about what we learned over all those many years.
Thank you, Dennis. Really, it was great, and I like that you continue with all your presentation. That we have all. We don't have so many questions, and I would like just in my next 10 minutes we go through that questions and the comments from the
Sure,
usually
sure.
families. Is that okay for you? You could see also Q&A like me, yes? That maybe I don't read everything to you. Did you see Q&A,
I do.
Dennis?
Uh-huh.
Yes. Okay, first one is from Dr. Ramani. Maybe you could read until I just make some other comments. I would like to thankful to all of you who wrote questions and answered. There were some things about organization, and I hope that we give you all information what you need. I'm so sorry that we don't have a Spanish translation and we can't help in this moment with the Spanish for the all people who are Spanish speaking. I would like suggest that when we have on ETSA channel on YouTube, when we'll have out this webinar, that you go and take automatic translation to help self to understand better what we have today in English because of a Spanish that we don't have. Dennis, did you have a time to read comments from Dr. Ramani?
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments was that her daughter she's a 20-year-old daughter with amazing auditory memory. And a dreamer. So, I mean, it's like basically saying my daughter's not at all like you describe. And I think that's great. That's really important. This is a little tricky because these are things that we consistently found, but people are different and they have different ways of approaching the world. Our job was simply to try to listen and learn, and whatever people brought to us, we found there were some consistencies, but there were also a lot of things that were different. And so it was helpful to kind of to listen. Anytime somebody presented something different, we would go back and begin to ask other families. She says, doctors, it can be detrimental to assume something about your child. Absolutely. So it may be safer to say most children have this pattern, but keep in mind, yeah, and I totally agree with that. In fact, that was pretty much the standard we used to try to just learn everything we can. And so I agree with that completely.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Dr. Ramani, for your answer and the comments. We have another, let's say, comments or question from Rosa. Is in Russian, and I will just say in English. She talked about that her son is arranging his things in the room, in the closet every evening. Is that sign of the stress, maybe? Because they're doing same things every evening in his room.
He's
Repeating.
Repeating the same event. I think some of that is just depends on whether that's out in the community at school or work or wherever he is. He may just need some alone time and so this repetitious activities, as long as they didn't keep people from doing what they needed to through the course of their day, it was actually helpful. A lot of our folks would watch their favorite movies or events while doing this too. So, if it's not, if it doesn't take up huge amounts of time and there's some tendency to relieve a little stress, that it shouldn't be a problem. If it takes too much time, then you got to look at what it's keeping them from, what is going on out in this world. And so we would often suggest to families they actually visit the very places your sons and daughters were and get a kind of read the room, see if there's something that is happening. hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, thanks a lot. And now we have a little bit more comments. We have one question also in comments from the Germany, when one mother explained how they come some difficulties about her son, 17 years old, when they change school, and they came with several difficulties in that time. Even there are some things okay, but there are still some problems with this change. What happened? Also.
Yeah, yeah,
She asked what she could do, but it's very hard to say. And on this distance, and also on this small amount of the information, that we say anything what will be helpful for this mom.
yeah. No, I mean,
It's really
change,
difficult to say anything
right? But we have seen change is really, really difficult for so many of our folks. If they change schools, or we had people moving into residential settings. And so the more preparation, the more they can see where they're going, the more, like my friend Jeremy, who went to Hawaii, if they get a chance to get there ahead of time and look at and try to repeat some of the things that they had from the former school, and also just to slow it down and just give people some breaks in the meantime. But change is really difficult. And visual can help a lot, and just having breaks where people can get away from a routine is helpful. Okay. So
Okay,
I
thanks.
agree,
We
it's
have
hard
one
to,
similar.
go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really hard in this change, but we have one similar, let's little bit similar comments, a question. How to help my daughter who had a trauma 10 years ago, but still is present?
Oh, I mean, we found that quite often, and it's really the best thing you want to do is just try to appreciate that those visual memories are still extremely strong. We had folks who were afraid of animals, but the families would eventually bring a dog into the house very, very slowly until there was some sense of comfort with the animal. And storms, so many of our folks are afraid of storms because of an event in their childhood around a storm. And so maybe just give them, a lot of our folks predict the weather better than the weather people because they're kind of tracking the storms. And so instead of fighting that, just give them tools to try to manage it. Maybe they can go into a special room and turn on music they love or earphones, because, but this was a huge issue for our folks, and it continues to be.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. We have let's say 3 minutes for some of these comments what we have. One, it is from Amrita: a visual memory in the children with visual difficulties. Is it the same level as those who does not have any visual problems?
No, visual memory was a huge strength. I think it was not that it was a problem. It was that it was just the main medium they took in the world. And so it's a huge positive thing. They learn from seeing other things and from copying people. And it was only a difficulty if they saw something that was problematic. So it's not a difficulty so much as just a way to manage and to take in and understand the world. And as long as you know that, you can help them with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another comment: how to overcome a child's fear of society so that she is not afraid to go out for work? Well,
Yeah, this is this happens a lot. And we found, like with my friend Jeremy, who was in Hawaii, who would have never gotten there, that if you try to use some kind of way for them to see where they're going, who they're with, to give them tools, make them feel comfortable, to actually show where they're going, what they're going to do, as hard as that is, the world can be frightening. You want to also find out if there's a sensory overload. For so many folks who are in stores where there was too much noise or too much light, or traffic was scary, if there's any event that um, reminds them of an original fear, then so the more you know your child and how they react to cars on the street, or then the more you can kind of build in answers to help them get someplace by actually targeting how to avoid certain things, or work with their own fear. But visual, if at all possible, use visual and help them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dennis. We have from Tanya. Tanya, so do you suggest not to teach appropriate behavior regarding self-talk? It may be a huge obstacle at the job settings.
Oh boy, yeah. No, I mean, see, self-talk will get in trouble because it engages people outside the job in ways. So we always viewed it as is something similar to hugging the wrong people. It's just something that will draw attention and create issues. High school kids, the same in school, sometimes they talking out loud, it creates stressors for them. So it's to take time and effort to help them learn when and where to create their own self-talk, because it's healthy. It's just out in public. It kind of gets in the way of, even though it can be helpful, maybe they can even write down what they're doing, or speak very softly into but in and of itself, it's not a problem. It's just how people respond to it. And so I'm sorry, I can't help you more. Usually when families would come in with these kind of questions, we take it apart and find out what was happening and kind of build some kind of a plan that the families felt comfortable with their sons and daughters. And usually there's a way. It just took some time and effort sometimes.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. We are a little bit now 2 more minutes than we planned. We have several comments, but I'm so sorry. We need to finish for today our webinar. All your comments are very nice, and I hope that we could continue with some other webinar and answer to you on this all your comments. Dennis, just for the end, do you would like to say to us something more to our, we are here parents, we are here people who are working in the different institutions, schools and special institution where our children could learn a lot and do you have any comments, any proposal for us like parents and who are listening for today just before we are closing?
Well, I just they were my teachers. I learned so much, but I think the more we understand what they want and need and what keeps them from being in the world, they have a right to be in the world and they can teach us so much. So it's up to us to help people find a way to be comfortable in the world. That being said, the world can be kind of a little bit of a problem, or difficult place, so you may need to build in some kind of safety issues for folks too. But we need people with Down syndrome in the community. They're heart people. They love people. They care for people. They're very conscientious and reliable in their jobs and in their ideas. And so I just, a world with people with Down syndrome is a better world.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dennis. You really always encourage us and give us, let's say, big, strong wind in our back to all of us. And thanks a lot for the webinar this afternoon. Thank to all of you who were together today with us. And please, if you would like to listen again and learn more from this webinar, go to Facebook. Then you will Facebook site of ETSA, because there you will have immediately complete our webinar, and also in few days we will have a webinar in English and all languages what we have today translated by our translators. Thanks a lot to all of you and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
And Dennis, to you, have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye now.